Black water filled my mouth before my mind even woke, and the first thing I understood was the taste of it, river silt and engine oil, and the sharp yellow bite of sulfur that coats everything in this town, even a man's last breath. My wrists were behind me, wired together so tight the metal had bitten down to the bone. My lungs were screaming. I couldn't see my own hands, couldn't see anything, because there was no light down there, none at all. Just the cold pressing in from every side, and a slick of trapped air no wider than a coffin lid, jammed against the underside of an overturned hull. That pocket of stale breath was all that stood between me and the bottom of the river. I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest. A week before that night, I was an ordinary man. Bruno, the foreman of the last private quay on this stretch of the river, the one my father built, plank by plank, before the mines hollowed out the hills. I logged barges. I shook hands with bargemen. I went home to a wife and a daughter, and I bothered no one. And then 3 men in a launch with no cargo decided my family's wharf was worth more than my life. So they took it. They beat me on the fog-wet planks until I stopped swinging back. They hung scrap iron off my belt, rolled me into a derelict barge, and scuttled it with me inside. Neat, quiet, no body to find. By morning, I'd be a name in the harbor ledger, with the word drowned written beside it, and the whole town would believe it. I heard their laughter fade as the hull went under. I felt the wire cut deeper as the wreck settled into the mud. And down there in the dark, with the air going sour against my lips, I made the only promise a dead man can make. If the river gave me back, every one of them was going into it. If you believe a drowned man can still come back to collect a debt, stay with me and subscribe, because this is only the moment the current turned. Let me take you back to before any of that, back to when I still slept easy, when the worst thing on my mind was a cracked piling and a load of ore running late. Our town sat in a bend of the river where the hills were eaten hollow by the sulfur mines. The whole valley smelled of struck matches. You stopped noticing it after a while. It got into your clothes, your bread, the back of your throat, yellow dust on every windowsill, yellow stain on the foam where the water curled past the pilings. The river was the only thing that ever paid honest money around there. Ore barges, timber rafts, sacks of coke moving downstream to the smelters, and the men who pulled those rafts and ran those barges, the river folk. They all knew one landing they could trust. Mine. My father built that wharf with his own 2 hands when I was a boy, hauling oak planks out of the spring flood and bolting them down one by one. He used to say a man's key is his handshake. Once it goes crooked, nobody trusts the whole town. When he passed, I kept it straight. Fair weight, fair price, no thumb on the scale. The last landing on that stretch that didn't answer to anyone. At home there was Helena, my wife, quick with the ledgers, quicker with her tongue, the steadiest person I've ever known. And our girl, Lila, 10 years old, and she's never heard a sound in her life, born that way. But that child reads the river better than men twice my age. She knows a storm's coming by the smell of the water an hour before the clouds. She feels a heavy barge moving by the way the planks shiver under her bare feet. That was my whole world. Small, plain, mine. Then one gray evening a sleek launch with no cargo aboard tied up at my quay. 3 quiet men sat in it. They bought nothing. They asked for nothing. They just watched my scales, and watched my hands, and watched the river folk come and go. And every bargeman who'd shaken my hand for years suddenly couldn't meet my eye. On the 4th evening, the man behind those quiet watchers finally stepped out of the launch. He was soft about everything. Soft voice, soft gloves, a calm that didn't suit a place that stank of struck matches. They called him Varick. He ran what the river folk had started whispering about all spring, a crew that had appeared from downriver and quietly bought, or broken, every landing along this stretch. Behind him came his 2 hands. Otto, a slab of a man with shoulders like a cargo winch and eyes that never blinked enough, and a younger one, Pike, wiry, restless, always thumbing a folding knife open and shut, like a tick he couldn't kill. Varick walked my planks like he already owned the bolts in them. He ran a gloved finger along my scale, tutted, and told me the river had a new arrangement now, a mooring fee. Every quay paid into his pocket each week, or a safety inspector came along and found the timber unsound, the license void, the landing closed. "It's simpler than it sounds," he said, smiling. "Everyone's already agreed. You're the last one being stubborn about it." I told him my father's wharf wasn't for rent. I told him the river folk landed here because they trusted the weight, and the day I started skimming them for some stranger off a launch, that trust was finished. Pike's knife stopped clicking. Otto shifted his weight, and the planks groaned under him. Varick only nodded, like a patient man hearing a child refuse to sleep. He looked out at the yellow foam curling past the pilings, at the fog already gathering low over the water. "You know what I like about this river, foreman?" he said quietly. "It keeps secrets. A man steps onto a wet plank in the dark, slips, goes under, and by morning he's just a name in the harbor ledger. Nobody argues with the ledger." He pulled his glove tight. "You've got 3 days to sign the quay over. Think it through. Drowned men don't haggle about fees." Then he stepped back into his launch, and the three of them slid off into the mist without another word, leaving me standing on my own planks, listening to the river move underneath me like it was already counting down. I did the right thing first. I want you to know that before any of the rest. I went to the law, the way an honest man is supposed to. The next morning I walked up to the harbor office with the muck of the river still on my boots. The harbor master sat behind his desk, fat and pink, a brass nameplate and a half-eaten roll in front of him. I told him about the launch, the fee, the threat. He listened with his eyes half closed, and when I finished, he just sighed and brushed crumbs off his ledger. "Foreman," he said, "I'd sign whatever they put in front of me if I were you. Cleaner that way." Then I saw it, the corner of a thick envelope tucked under his blotter, the kind that doesn't come from any wharf's honest week. He saw me see it. He didn't even have the shame to cover it. The constable was worse. He poured me a glass of something cheap, called me a good man, and told me a story about 2 key holders upstream who'd gone stubborn last winter. One slipped off his own dock in the fog. The other's skiff came back empty. Accidents, both. He said the word like it tasted sweet. That's when I understood there was no door in this town that opened for me. Every lock had already been bought. I came home and Helena read it on my face before I said a word. She set down the ledger, took my hands in hers, and begged me, "Just sign, Bruno. Take Lila, take the river road, start clean somewhere downstream. A landing isn't worth a grave." And God help me, I almost listened. But I thought of my father's hands on those oak planks, and every bargeman who landed here because the weight was true, and I couldn't be the one who handed them all to a man in soft gloves. So I told her no, we'd hold the key. That night, long after the lamp was out, I heard it through the window, a single lantern blinking across the black water, a signal. When I stepped onto my own dock to look, Otto and Pike were already standing on it, and Pike had a coil of wire in his hands. I told Helena to bolt the door and keep Lila in the back room, and I stepped out onto my own planks to meet them. The fog was thick that night, hanging off the water like wet wool, and the lanterns smeared yellow halos through it. Pike grinned at me with that coil of wire looped over his shoulder. Otto said nothing at all. He just rolled those heavy shoulders and came. I'm no soft man. I got 2 good hits in, split Pike's lip, drove an elbow into Otto's ribs that should have folded a smaller man. But Otto wasn't smaller. He took it like a piling takes a barge, and then a winch hook came around out of the dark and caught me across the back of the skull. The world tilted. My knees hit the boards. After that, it was boots, ribs, kidneys, the side of my head, again and again, until the planks under my cheek were slick with something warm, and the fog had a red edge to it. I felt them turn me over, felt the wire bite into my wrist behind my back, felt the cold, dead weight of scrap iron being hooked through my belt, link by link, so the river would keep me down. And through all of it, that soft, patient voice. Varick had come to watch. He crouched by my face so I could hear him clearly. "You should have signed, foreman," he murmured. "Now you're just an accident. Give my regards to the wife. She'll sail quick once she's burying you." They dragged me to the old ore barge moored at the end of the dock, the derelict one with its belly already half rotted through. They rolled me down into its overturned hull, into the dark and the standing water, and I heard the hatch slam. Then a knocking all along the seams, Pike with a bar knocking the rotten plugs loose. The river started coming in cold around my legs, my chest, my chin. The laughter on the deck above grew faint. The barge groaned, tilted, and slid under. And the last thing I heard from the world of the living was the gurgle of black water closing over the iron, and my own breath, fast and small, in a shrinking pocket of air. A drowning man is supposed to fight, then panic, then go still. I'll tell you what saved me. I stopped fighting first. When the barge settled into the mud, the water rose to my chin and stopped. The overturned hull had trapped a wedge of air against its top, that pocket I told you about, no wider than a coffin lid. Stale, foul, tasting of rot and sulfur, but it was air. And as long as I kept my chin up and my breathing slow, the river couldn't have me yet. So I made myself a clock. In, hold, out, slow. Panic burns air, and I had no air to burn. My wrists were the whole world. The wire had cut to the bone, but my fingers still moved, and a few inches behind me I found a rib of the hull crusted with old barnacles, sharp little edges. I started sawing the wire against them. Back and forth, in the black, by feel alone. Hours it must have been. The shells tore my hands worse than the wire. I felt the blood run warm down my fingers and go cold in the river. The chill climbed up from my legs into my chest, and twice I came close to just opening my mouth and letting it end, because ending it would be warm and quiet and easy. What kept my chin up was a picture. Lila on the dock at dawn, her bare feet on the shivering planks, her small hands shaping a word at me. And Helena alone, lied to, burying an empty box. Then the wire gave, one strand, then the rest, and my arms came free, and I nearly drowned right there from the shock of it. I felt along the hull in the dark, plate by plate, until I found where the old iron had sprung, a gap where two plates had torn apart in the scuttling. Cold current pushed through it, hard and steady. The river pulling downstream on the far side. I got my fingers into that gap and felt the width of it, barely a hand's span, iron edges like broken teeth, and beyond it, a current strong enough to drown a strong man. To live, I'd have to leave skin on that iron and trust the same river that buried me to carry me out. I took one last lungful of that rotten air and went through the gap head first. The iron tore me. I felt it open my shoulder, peel a long stripe down my back, but pain stopped mattering the second the current caught me. The river snatched me out like a hand and threw me downstream into the dark, tumbling, no up and no down, my chest already screaming for air I didn't have. I don't know how I surfaced. I just remember my face breaking the skin of the water, and the cold night air going into me like a blade, and the stars wheeling overhead, indifferent, while the current rolled me along past the black shapes of the bank. It carried me a long way. Past the last lights of town, past the smelter, out to where the river spreads thin and slow over the reed flats and the rotting pylons of the old marsh landings. I caught a half-sunk piling with both arms and just hung there, breathing, bleeding, alive, and not believing it. I crawled out into the reeds on my hands and knees and lay in the mud like something the river had spat back. That's where Cortis found me at first light. An old net fisher who lives alone out on the flats, mute as a stone, who'd known my father back when the wharf was young. He didn't gasp, didn't ask questions he couldn't have voiced anyway. He just dragged me into his shack, set my cracked ribs with strips of canvas, packed my torn shoulder with river clay and clean rag, and kept me hidden. I drifted in and out for days, and on one of those days, a rafter tied up at Cordis's flats for water, and I heard him talking, heard him say my name. He said the foreman from the upriver quay had drowned, slipped off his own dock in the fog, poor soul. The widow had already half buried him with an empty box, and the wharf, well, the wharf had been signed over to that new crew, all legal, all quiet. I lay there in the dark of that shack and understood the strangest thing of my whole life. To everyone I'd ever known, I was already dead, and a dead man can walk through doors the living never will. So I let the dead man stay dead. It wasn't a hard choice once I'd thought it through. A living man could be threatened, bought, drowned a second time. A dead man has nothing left to lose, and that makes him the most dangerous thing on any river. I gave myself the weeks I needed to heal. Cordis fed me eels and black bread, and said nothing while my ribs knit and the long wound on my shoulder closed into a hard pink seam. And while my body mended, my mind did the only work it knew. Not rage. Rage is loud and stupid. It gets a man killed. I worked it cold. I mapped them the way I'd always mapped the river. The choke points, the slack water, the rotten timber that looks solid till you put weight on it. There were 4 of them, and I named them like a tally I meant to keep. Pike, who'd carried the wire and knocked the plugs loose. Otto, the slab who took my best hits and didn't feel 'em. The fat harbor master with the envelope under his blotter who'd turned me away. And last, the soft voice in the gloves. Varick, the man who'd come just to watch. Varick would be the end of it. The others were the road there. And here was the thing I held on to, lying in that shack on the flats. These were men who used the river as a weapon. Currents, fog, scuttled wrecks, all the river's quiet ways of swallowing a man whole. So that's exactly how they'd be paid. Ice and undertow and rotten hulls. Let the river take them, the way they'd let it take me. I'd touch no money, leave no body the law could pin to my name. And when it was done, the quay would go back to Helena and the river folk, and I'd be gone downstream before anyone counted the bodies. Then a peddler passed Cordis's flats, and I heard the newest gossip from town. The crew had moved Otto onto my own wharf, set him up as the new keeper in my father's chair. And Helena and Lila were still living in the house beside it, cooking for the crew, scrubbing their floors, under the threat that worse would come if they didn't. My family was already in their hands, and I was a dead man with a list. The first night I went back upriver, I went only to look. I took Cordis's flat little skiff, the kind that draws no wake and makes no sound, and I poled up against the bank in the small hours, hidden by the same fog that had hidden them the night they buried me. The town slept. The smelter chimney breathed its faint yellow glow over the water, and there, at the end of the bend, sat my father's wharf, my own planks, with another man's lantern burning on them. I tied off in the reeds across the channel, and I watched. That's the part nobody tells you about a thing like this. Most of it is watching, holding still while your own blood begs you to move. I saw Lila first, my girl, out on the dock at dusk, hauling a bucket twice her size. One of the crew flicked something at her back, and she turned and signed at him, sharp, furious, both small hands cutting the air. She couldn't hear his laugh, but I could. It carried clear across the water, and it put a taste of iron in my mouth. Then Helena, in the doorway of our house, a yellow bruise along one wrist, calling Lila inside with a tiredness in her shoulders I'd never seen before. And in the lamplight on the dock, easy as a man who owns the world, sat Otto, in my father's chair. Boots up on my father's rail. Every muscle in me wanted to cross that channel right then and end him with my hands. I didn't. A dead man who shows himself too soon is just a living man again, and a living man they could kill twice. So I did the only thing I let myself do that night. Before I poled away, I slipped up to the far bollard, the one out at the channel's edge, and I tied a knot around it. An old river folk knot, the kind the bargemen loop for a man the water has taken, so his soul can find its way home. Every soul on this river knows that knot and what it means. Let them find it in the morning. Let them start to feel a cold hand they couldn't see. And the one most likely to understand it was the one who'd wound the wire around my wrists. Pike was the one I'd take first, and he made it easy by being a thief. I'd watched him 3 nights running. Every week the crew skimmed their fees off the bargemen, and every week Pike skimmed a little off the top of that, peeling notes off the roll and stashing them where Varick wouldn't look. A greedy man and a frightened one, which is the most useful kind of enemy there is. Frightened men believe in ghosts. The river had started to freeze along the slack pools by then, that first thin black ice that won't hold a cat. I picked the old loading basin below the bend, where the water sits dead and the ice skins over smooth as a window, and I baited him. I let the word reach him, the way word travels on a river, that the drowned foreman's hidden money was still aboard a wreck moored out in that basin, a man's life savings, never found. For a thief like Pike, that was a hook with no barb needed. I waited under the bank, packed in reeds and river mud, my breath held tight in my chest so it wouldn't show in the cold. Near midnight, his lantern came bobbing down the towpath. He was alone, of course. A man doesn't bring witnesses to money he means to keep. He stepped out onto the basin ice toward the wreck, testing it, cursing under his breath. He reached the hull, lifted his lantern, and there, nailed where his treasure should have been, was that knot, the drowned man's loop, tied fresh. I watched the lantern shake in his hand. I heard him say my name, just once, a small, cracked whisper into the dark. Bruno? And then, slow, from the black water of the ice hole right behind his heels, I rose. Hair streaming, the long, pale seam down my shoulder showing in the lantern light, water sheeting off me into the cold. A drowned man, climbing back out of the river he'd been thrown into, standing up behind the boy who'd wound the wire. Pike opened his mouth to scream. The ice gave a long, deep crack beneath his boots, and the lantern went out. I could have let the ice finish him. I didn't. I had a better idea of justice than that. The black ice split under his weight and dropped him to the chest in the freezing slack water, and I was on him before he could thrash. I caught a fistful of his collar and held him down at the ice hole, held him there, his face going under and coming up, under and up, while he choked and clawed at my arm. Long enough for him to taste it, the cold flooding in, the dark closing over. Exactly the death he'd handed me and laughed about. "Feel that, Pike?" I said into his ear, calm as the water. "That's what you did. That's the gift you wrapped for me." When he was past fighting, I dragged him up onto the bank and bound his hands behind him with wire, the same cold gauge he'd used on me. I left it on him just long enough to mark his wrists the way mine were marked. Then I cut it loose and let the river cold do the rest. By dawn, his hands had gone the color of tallow. That knife-quick grip of his, that little folding blade he loved to thumb open, those fingers would never close on a hilt again. He lay shaking in the reeds, weeping, and I crouched where he could see me clear in the gray first light. "Look at me. I'm the foreman you drowned." I climbed back out. "Tell Varick a dead man's walking his river. Or don't. Either way, you'll spend the rest of your nights listening for the ice to crack." He told no one who I was. He was far too frightened for that. But the river folk found him at sunup, crawling along the towpath, raving about a drowned man rising up out of the ice behind him. Soaked, ruined-handed, half out of his mind. The story moved up the bank faster than any current, and when it reached the soft voice in the gloves, Varick, sitting safe in his stolen house, he didn't laugh. He went very quiet. He sent men to walk the wharf with lanterns, and for the first time, that careful man started turning over a question in the dark. Whose body, he wondered, had they never actually pulled from the river? A town like ours runs on whispers, and within a week, the whisper had a name. The drowned foreman walks the river. You'd think they'd have laughed it off. They didn't. A river town believes the river. Old women started leaving bread on the bollards. Bargemen who'd kept their heads down began tying that homecoming knot on their own mooring posts. Quiet little defiances, one after another, up the bank. The crew tore them off and found 2 more by nightfall. Varick answered the only way his kind knows. He squeezed harder. He doubled the men on the wharf, kept lanterns burning all night along my father's planks, and let it be known that anyone caught spreading ghost talk would answer for it. Fear is the only tool a man like that owns, and he reached for it the way a drowning man reaches for an oar. Then they came for Helena. 2 of them, asking questions in our own kitchen. Was it possible, the talk going round, that the foreman hadn't drowned at all? Had she ever seen the body? Did she know something she wasn't saying? And here's the part that twisted in me like a hook. She didn't know. She still believed me dead. She'd buried an empty box and grieved a real grave. So when she looked those men dead in the eye and said flat and steady, I washed him myself for burial. My husband is gone. She wasn't covering for me. She was telling the only truth she had. I was across the channel in the reeds, watching the lamplight in our window, and I understood the price of what I was doing. To keep moving like a shadow, I had to leave my own wife inside her grief. I couldn't knock on that door. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But there was someone in that house the others couldn't fool. Lila came out at dusk to fill the water bucket, and at the bollard she stopped. She picked up the loop of knotted rope I'd left, and she lifted it to her face, and she breathed it in. River mud, tar, and something under that, something her hands had known her whole short life. And my deaf little girl went very still and began, slowly, to tremble. My daughter has never heard a single word in her life, but that night she heard me anyway, in the only language she'd ever truly trusted. Her hands, her nose, the shiver of the planks. She knew. Before anyone with working ears suspected a thing, Lila knew her father wasn't in that box. The next dusk, I watched from the reeds and saw her come to the bollard again, careful, looking back at the lit windows where the crew sat, eating the supper Helena had been made to cook. She crouched down and set something small on the post. Then she slipped away. When the wharf went dark, I poled across and took it up in my hand. A little fish, whittled out of soft willow, clumsy and lopsided. I knew it the second my thumb found it. I'd carved its twin for her years back, taught her to whittle her own with my knife guiding her small fingers. It was our sign, ours alone. A fish meant, I'm here. A fish meant, I see you. I stood on my own stolen planks in the dark with that little willow thing in my fist, and I'll tell you, that was harder than the ice, harder than the wire. Everything in me wanted to cross to that door, throw it open and gather her up, to tell Helena, I'm not dead. I came back. I'm here. But if I showed myself, the whole frail thing would shatter. A living foreman could be hunted, my family with him. A man in soft gloves would simply burn the house down and call that an accident too. The only weapon I had left was being a dead man, and I couldn't spend it on a single embrace. So I gave her the only answer a ghost is allowed to give. I tied a knot around the bollard, right where her fish had sat, the homecoming loop, but tied the way my father taught me, with the extra turn no stranger would know. A message just for her. Wait. Trust. I'm working. I melted back into the reeds before first light, but I'd been clumsy, lingering too long. And out of the dark of the wharf, slow and heavy, the slab-shouldered keeper came down the planks and found Lila standing at the bollard, her small hand still resting on the rope. From the reeds, I saw the big man's hand close on my daughter's shoulder, and the cold patience I'd lived inside for weeks nearly cracked wide open. He spun her around. She couldn't hear him bark his questions, and that only made him angrier. Who tied this? Who've you been signing to? Who comes to this post at night? He shook her, the way you'd shake a sack. Lila's face went white, but she didn't cry out. My girl never gives them that. I made myself wait. One reckless move, and I'd lose everything. So I forced my eyes off her and onto the keeper himself, and I started taking him apart in my head the way I'd taken apart the river. I'd been studying Otto for days already. He had habits, the way slow, strong men do. Every slack tide, in the dead hour before dawn, he ran the big cargo winch alone, that groaning iron crane bolted to the old king post at the dock's end, the one we used to swing loaded hulls into the quay. He liked the winch, liked the power of it, the way 100 tons of barge swung wherever he cranked. And he'd taken to hiding the crew's ore cache in the winch shed, certain no one would dare go near his machine. That king post was older than I was. 2 nights running, I'd swum under the dock in the freezing dark and worked at its base with a chisel, loosening the rotten bolts, cutting the bracket halfway through, leaving it looking whole and standing on nothing but rust and habit. I'd already slacked the holding line on a loaded scrap hull moored upstream of it, so that one good pull of the current would swing that hull across the dock end like a wrecking weight. It was all set, waiting for slack tide. And now the keeper had my daughter by the shoulder. He shoved Lila ahead of him, down the planks toward the winch shed, to lock her in while he decided what to do with a girl who tied ghost knots. Straight toward the king post. And as I watched, the cold went out of me all at once, and pure ice fear took its place. Because the rotten post, the loosened bracket, the swinging hull I'd rigged to crush a man, my little girl was walking right into the middle of it. There was no more waiting. I went out of the reeds and across the open dock, a dead man walking into lantern light, and I didn't care who saw. Otto heard the plank shift behind him and turned, shoving Lila aside toward the king post to free his hands. That shove was the worst thing he could have done. It put her square under the dock end, right where the swinging hull would come. I didn't go for him. I went for her. I crossed those boards faster than my battered ribs should have allowed, caught my daughter by the collar and the arm, and threw the 2 of us sideways off the line of the post, hard onto the planks, my body wrapped around hers. Otto roared and lunged after us, his full weight slamming into the old king post as he came. And the river kept its appointment. The current took the loosened scrap hull upstream and swung it down on its slack line, slow and enormous, 100 tons of rusted iron coming round like the hand of something patient. The king post I'd cut through groaned, cracked at its rotten base, and went. The winch in its iron arm whipped loose, and the swinging hull met Otto exactly where he stood, drove him back against the very machine he loved, the winch he'd lorded over, and folded the 2 of them together with a sound I still hear. The whole dock end tore free and slid into the black water, taking the keeper and his crane and his hidden cache down into the river all at once. The river took him the way it takes everything, without a word. Then it was quiet, just the slap of disturbed water and Lila's heart hammering against my chest. I rolled up and looked at her, and for one held breath, my daughter looked straight into my face, close enough to feel my breath, and her eyes went wide and wet, not with fear. She knew me. She pressed one small hand flat over my soaked chest, the way she used to when she was tiny and wanted to feel me speak. Then I heard boots, more crew coming at the noise. I had to go. I touched her cheek once and slipped over the dock edge into the dark. She told him nothing, but the soft voice in the gloves had lost 2 men now, and started baiting a trap with the only thing I had left to lose. 2 of his men gone, and the soft voice in the gloves finally stopped pretending it was the Warsaw competition. Varick understood now that something was hunting him, picking his crew off the river one at a time. So he did the cold-blooded thing. He decided to make the ghost come to him. I heard how he set it up. He brought Helena out into the open, in the middle of the day, on the steps of the harbor office where the whole town could watch. He stood her there, pale and trembling, and announced that the drowned foreman's widow would sign over every last river right her family held, the quay, the moorings, the channel claims, all of it, by his hand that very night. And then, loud enough to carry, he let it slip. At midnight he'd put her aboard a barge and run her downstream to the notary at the next town to make it final. It was bait, and he didn't bother hiding the hook. He wanted the ghost to know exactly where Helena would be, and exactly when. A barge on dark water, his men packed in the hold with knives, waiting for a dead man stupid enough to come for his wife. I knew it for a trap the moment I heard it. Any fool would. But here's what Varick didn't reckon on. While I crouched in the alley behind the harbor office, working out how to turn his snare back on him, I heard another voice through the cracked office window. The fat harbor master, the third name on my tally, the one who'd waved me off with an envelope under his blotter. He was bragging, pouring himself a drink and laughing about how he'd forged the drowning paper himself, signed me dead for a cut of the quay, neat as you like. So now I had all of them in one place, the soft killer, the bought official, and my Helena, made into a lure on dark water. Midnight came cold and starless. The bait barge cast off from the wharf with my wife standing small at its rail, and armed men crouched below her in the hold. And I untied Cordis's skiff, and I rowed out toward it, straight into the trap, on purpose. A trap only works if both men play by the same map, and nobody on this river knew its map like I did. Varick's men thought they'd chosen the spot. They hadn't. The channel below the bend has a sandbar that shows its teeth at the turn of the tide. Every bargeman alive curses it, and every one of them knows to give it a wide berth. The crew running that barge were town men and hired knives. They didn't know the water, they only knew the orders. So before I went anywhere near them, I slipped downstream in the dark and did the quiet work. I dove under the bait barge's stern and cut its lower mooring slack to a single frayed turn, then loosened the rudder pin so it would swing free. I'd read the ebb. In 20 minutes, the falling tide would drag that barge sideways straight onto the bar, and I'd let the river do the heavy lifting. I waited in the reeds, breath held, hand on the gunwale of Cordis's little skiff. Right on the turn, it happened. The current grabbed the loosened barge and swung it broadside. The hull lurched. The deck tilted hard, and with a long, grinding shudder, it grounded fast on the sandbar, listing in the black water. Below in the hold, I heard the knives stumble and curse and pile against the canted boards. That was my moment. Fog on the water, a tilted deck, men off their feet, and the dark. All of it mine. I came up the listing side without a sound. The first one fumbling at the rail never saw me. One hard shove, and the river took him. The second turned at the splash, and I put him over after, his lantern hissing out as it hit the water. They couldn't tell where the deck ended and the channel began. I worked them off that barge the way you bail a sinking boat, steady, one at a time, never raising a weapon the law could name, just the dark and the cold and the drop. When the deck was clear, I crossed to the hold hatch where Helena was bound, and I threw it open. She looked up into the lantern light and saw a drowned man's face and screamed. Her scream cut off the moment she truly looked at me. Then she went so still, I thought her heart had stopped. "Helena, it's me. It's Bruno." I crouched into the lantern light so she could see the whole of my face. "I'm not a ghost. I'm here. I'm alive." She didn't move toward me. She pressed back against the canted boards of the hold, her bound hands shaking, her eyes going over my soaked clothes, the long scar at my collar, like she was reading a wound. And when she spoke, it wasn't joy. It came out of her low and broken. "I buried you," she whispered. "I washed an empty box with my own hands. I held our girl while she cried herself sick. And you've been out there all these weeks, letting me grieve a man who was breathing? I cut her wrists free. The rope fell away. She didn't reach for me. If I'd come to the door, I said, they'd have burned the house with all three of us inside and called it the river. A dead man could fight them. A live one couldn't. I had to stay drowned, Helena. It was the only weapon left. The barge creaked under us, listing on the bar, the fog dripping off the rail. She looked at me a long moment, and something in her face broke open. Not forgiveness, not yet, just the grief turning over into something raw. She put one trembling hand against my chest, the same way Lila had, as if to check that a heart still beat under it. "You frightened the men off this boat," she breathed. "You did it. Then it's nearly over. Come home, please. Just come home." "Not yet." The word cost me. "There's one more, and he won't stop with me." That's when she told me the rest, fast and low, the thing I needed and dreaded. The forged drowning paper was only half of it. Varick and the fat harbor master had the key's deed of transfer set for dawn. Final, sealed, legal. If those papers stood when the sun came up, the river folk lost every honest landing on the water. Forever. And dawn was already graying the fog upstream. The fat man with the envelope was the third name on my tally, and I went for him before the ink could dry on his crime. I put Helena in Cordis's skiff and sent her downstream to the marsh flats, where the old net fisher would keep her and Lila hidden. Then I cut back to town through the gray, dripping dawn. The harbor office sat dark on its pilings above the water, and I knew it the way I knew my own hands. There's a flooded cellar under it that the river fills at high tide, with a hatch in the floor of the records room that nobody bothers to lock, because who climbs up through cold water in the dark? A drowned man does. I went in under the building, up through the hatch, water sheeting off me onto the floorboards. The harbor master was slumped at his desk, snoring over an empty bottle, the lamp guttering, and spread out before him, weighted with his brass nameplate, the deed of transfer, and beside it, the forged paper that had signed me dead. I gathered both into my coat. Then I found the thing I really wanted, his ledger, the fat little book where he'd written down every bribe, every cut, every drowning dressed up as an accident, in his own neat hand, kept, no doubt, so he could blackmail Varick if the soft voice ever turned on him. Greedy men always keep a record. I set my wet hand flat on the desk. He jerked awake, saw me, and the color drained out of his face like water out of a cracked cup. "You signed me into a grave for a slice of my own key," I said quietly. "Now you're going to sign me back out." I didn't break his hands. The river's logic doesn't fit a paper man. His crime was ink, so ink would be his ruin. I put a pen in his shaking fingers and a fresh page under them, and I stood over him while he wrote out the whole filthy truth and signed the key back to my family with his own confession beneath it. When it was done, he was weeping, and through the tears he blurted the thing he thought might save him, that Varick had already sent 2 men with kerosene to burn the wharf, with Helena and my deaf girl meant to be inside it by dawn. Kerosene. My wife and my deaf girl, and dawn already coming up gray over the water. I left the harbor master weeping over his own confession, and I ran. But running alone wasn't going to be enough, and I knew it. One man, however cold, couldn't be in 2 places, the wharf and the flats, at the same time. So I did the thing I'd never let myself do in all these weeks. I stopped hiding. I went down to the bargeman's row, where the river folk were already stirring in the half-light, and I hammered on the first door with my soaked fist. The man who opened it took one look and went white as bone, because he knew my face from a funeral. The drowned foreman, standing dripping on his step. I didn't waste breath on ghost stories. I held up the harbor master's ledger, and I read them the truth in his own hand. Every accident on this river that was no accident. Every man this crew had waded and sunk. The cut the law took to look away. The key holders upstream who'd slipped. Their friends, their kin. I watched the fear in their faces turn over into something else, something that had been smothered under that soft voice for a year and was only waiting for a spark. These were men who tied homecoming knots on their bollards in the dark, hoping. Now hope had a face and a paper that proved them right. He sent men to burn the foreman's wharf this morning, I told him. My wife's blood and my girl's. If we let it stand, every honest landing on this water is theirs. Are you river folk, or are you his? One old rafter spat on his own floor, reached behind the door, and came out with a gaff hook. Then the next, then the whole row, pulling on boots, taking up pike poles and chains and boat hooks, a low, growing rumble of men who'd been afraid too long. I left them gathering, and I ran for my own quay through the thinning fog, lungs burning, the river hissing along the bank beside me. I came round the last bend onto my father's planks just as two of Varick's men were splashing kerosene along the boards, and Varick himself stood at the house door with a lit torch in his hand, and Lila held in front of him. I'd planned every kill on this river cold, from the shadows, by the water's own hand. This one I did in the open, on my own father's planks, with the whole gray morning watching. I stopped dead at the edge of the dock. Kerosene fumes burned my throat, sharp over the sulfur. Two men froze mid-pour, cans dripping. And there in the doorway stood the soft voice in his soft gloves, torch crackling in one fist, my deaf girl clamped against him with the other. Varick's eyes found me and went white. Not surprised, terrified. Some animal part of him had believed the river talk all along, and now the drowned man stood on the wharf he'd stolen, dripping, scarred, real. "You can't be," he breathed. "I am." I walked onto the boards, slow, hands open. "You sealed me in a flooded hull and let the river have me. The river gave me back. Now put the torch down and let go of my daughter." He laughed, high and cracked, and pressed the flame closer to the soaked planks. "One move and it all goes up. Her, the wife, this rotten little quay, all of it." But Lila couldn't hear his threats, and that was the thing he'd never understood about her. She watched my hands. I dropped 2 fingers low against my thigh, our old sign, down, drop, the word I'd taught her by the river years ago. And my girl went boneless in his grip, dead weight, sliding straight down out of his arm. The instant she cleared him, I was across the boards. I knocked the torch wide. It hit the wet planks and guttered in a puddle instead of a kerosene seam. Then I had him. We went down together in the reek and the fumes, his soft gloves clawing at my face, and all his careful calm gone to pure, scrabbling fear. I drove him back off the doorstep, across his stolen dock, toward the open black water at the channel's edge, the same water he'd fed so many men to. His 2 cans men dropped everything and ran when they saw the river folk pouring round the bend with their gaffs. I had him bent over the dock edge now, the cold river breathing up at us both, and the soft voice, for the first time, begged. "Please." The soft voice had gone to a whimper, his face inches above the black water he'd fed so many men to. "Not the river, anything but the river. I'll give you everything, the money, the deed, the whole stretch. Just don't drown me." And there it was, the exact mercy I'd begged for through a rotten hull, with the wire eating my wrists, the same word he'd laughed at when others said it to him. I held him over the edge a long moment, and I'll be honest with you, every cold thing in me wanted to let go, hold his head under till the bubbles stopped, the way the air pocket had nearly stopped mine. It would have been even. It would have been the river's own arithmetic. But I looked down at his terror, and I understood something I hadn't planned on. Drowning him would only make me one more thing the river swallowed and the town forgot. He'd have his quiet grave and his legend, The man in the gloves would simply vanish, like everyone he'd erased. He didn't deserve quiet. He deserved to be seen. So I hauled him back from the edge and threw him down on his own wet planks in front of all of them. The river folk had come round the bend now, gaffs and chains in hand, a wall of the people he'd terrorized for a year, and behind them, drawn by the smoke and the shouting, the constable, the bought law himself, who'd looked the other way for his cut, now boxed in by a crowd that had the harbor master's ledger and every name in it. I took a length of mooring line and tied Varick to the dock's iron ring with the river folks' homecoming knot, the loop for the drowned, the one he'd never bothered to learn. I tied him to it and stepped back. "You're not going in the water," I told him. "You're going to stand on this dock and answer to every soul you sank. That's worse, and you know it." The bargeman closed in around him. The constable, with the whole town watching and a confession in plain sight, had nowhere left to hide. The River King belonged to the river folk now, and I had one thing left to do before the sun was fully up. The thing I had left to do was the hardest of all. I had to disappear. You'd think the winning would feel like winning. It didn't. While the river folk dragged Varick off the dock and the cornered constables stood gabbling over the harbor master's ledger, I slipped back from my own planks the way I'd come to them. Quiet, unseen, a man the town was sure was dead. I left the confession and the restored deed pressed into the old rafter's hands, the key clear and clean in Helena's name. Then I melted into the reeds. Because here's the truth nobody warns you of. A drowned man can't simply come back to life. If I walked into the daylight, the same law that had been bought once would need someone to hang for 2 crippled men and a river king fed to a mooring ring. My family would be tied to a killer for the rest of their days. The only way to keep them safe was to stay a ghost. So I went back out to Cordis's shack on the flats, and I sat in the dark, and I waited for the shaking to stop. It didn't, not for weeks. I'd close my eyes and feel the wire again, taste that rotten pocket of air. I'd hear the king post crack, hear Varick begging, and wake with my own hands clenched around nothing. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. I'd become the very thing the river makes of a man it takes and won't quite keep. Cordis never said a word. He couldn't, but he'd sit beside me through the worst of the nights, mending his nets by lantern light, just so I wasn't alone with it. From the reeds at dawn, I'd watch my own wharf in the distance. The bargeman had set to work repairing the torn dock end, fair scales going back up, that homecoming knot tied openly on every bollard now, not for the dead anymore, but for the living. And Helena, free at last, walking the planks with the ledgers under her arm. I'm no hero, I want that understood. I was only the man who paid a debt the law refused to. And then, one gray evening, 2 small figures came out to the very edge of the marsh looking for me. It was Helena and Lila, picking their way along the reed path in the last gray light. They'd known. Of course they'd known. The carved fish, the knot tied my father's way. They'd come to the water's edge because they understood what I had to do, and they'd come to say it without making me say it first. Helena stopped a few feet from me. She didn't ask me to stay. She'd already wept that out of herself somewhere I couldn't see. She just looked at me a long moment, then pressed the ledger's last clean page into my hand, the quay's account, paid clear, the family name written at the top in her own steady script, proof for me to carry that it was theirs and free. Then Lila stepped close. She took the little willow fish from her pocket, the clumsy one I'd carved her years ago, and folded it back into my palm. And she lifted her hands and made me one sign, not the one for stay, the one I'd dreaded. Her small fingers shaped it slow, so I couldn't mistake it. Go. And then, before I could break, a second sign laid over the first. Live. I closed my fist around the fish. There was nothing to say that her hands hadn't already said better. The willow stayed warm in my grip long after I'd pushed Cordis's skiff off the mud, and that small warmth was the whole of what I got to keep. A girl who couldn't hear the river telling her drowned father to keep breathing through whatever came next. The fog came down on the water as I poled into the current. Behind me, the lamps of the wharf were lighting one by one, fair scales swinging on honest hooks, a town that would never know whose hands had given it back its quiet. They didn't need to know. I slid past the last bend, and the river closed gray behind me, and the man they'd buried stayed buried. If you've carried a debt that no court would ever settle for you, leave a word below. Say what you'd have done on that dock. I read every one, the way the river reads every soul it carries.